It's the California chapter of the National Association for Multicultural Education. And a group of us met in Los Angeles and spent about a day and a half hashing out what our purpose would be. As a group, we are committed to developing multicultural, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive projects within an education system that fully embraces the diversity of California's students, and that is rooted in the needs and interests of historically dominated and institutionally marginalized communities. We stand for the public good and community-based schools influenced primarily by teachers, students, and families. We have seen how the forces of neoliberal privatization have shifted the emphasis away from public ownership of schools, and we are experiencing the standardization of pedagogy and curriculum driven by the market forces that include textbook and testing corporations. We stand against a colorblind, oppression-blind ideology that attempts to erase rather than embrace any kind of difference. In founding the organization, we were concerned about wanting to have a statewide voice that could speak back to statewide policies. In California, there are a lot of small progressive organizations, but not really a statewide organization that would speak directly to the issues that I just read. So we wanted to try to put together a way of being able to have a statewide voice, both to support teachers as well as to speak to policymakers. Because we're concerned that the reform paradigm right now that is really driving education is a top-down paradigm in which teachers are supposed to do what they're told to do, administrators are supposed to do what they're told to do, kids are supposed to do what they're told to do. And families have been framed in this paradigm as consumers of education, but not really as definers of education. And what we were concerned with is trying to figure out a way of flipping the paradigm so that it becomes communities that help decide what kind of education makes most sense for the kids who live in those communities. And then communities help to construct education from the bottom up. I'm going to focus in my relatively short talk here on what teachers can do in this context, mainly because I spent a lot of my professional life working as a teacher educator and trying to help teachers come to grapple with these concepts. But I first want to situate the work of teachers within, for some of you who are looking at Confronting Neoliberalism, what's that? Start by unpacking what is neoliberalism and a little bit about where did it come from. But first, before I do that, I want to look at some research that, even though I'm not exactly like a test-driven person, sometimes test results are useful and can be useful for helping to look critically at whether a difference is being made. So I will turn to some test results from the National Assessment for Education Progress. Can you all see this? If you can't and you need to get up and move, then please do so. This is a graph that illustrates what would look like the closing of the racial achievement gap between 1992 and 2011. The National Assessment for Education Progress is a test that's been given in the United States to samples of students in 4th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade since the 1970s. And it becomes actually a useful tool for looking at the impact of policy on kids. And so this line here is how white 8th graders did in literacy, and this line here is how African American 8th graders did in literacy from 1992 to 2011. And what's important about this 1992 date is that that's when the standards movement and the testing movement began. So you can look at data like this and go, well, I guess the achievement gap is sort of closing, so we must more or less be on the right track. So let me go back to the 1970s and look at literacy data first for 9-year-olds. So you have white students, African American students, and Latino students. And it looks like when the standards movement began, right around here, particularly for African American and Latino students, literacy dropped and then started inching up again. So, you know, you go, well, yeah, okay. Now let's look at middle school age students. The achievement gap, racial achievement gap, was narrowest in 1988. Standards movement came along, and for students of color, achievement dropped and has sort of partially come back. Now but the progress was most before the standards movement. Now let's look at high school kids. Okay? Huge gains during the 70s and 80s. The standards movement came along, literacy dropped, and hasn't recovered. So this says to me that the paradigm that's being used to supposedly improve education, that is couched a lot around closing racial achievement gaps, is the wrong paradigm. It's not working well even by the kinds of testing measures that people who are advocating for the test-driven, standardized, curriculum-driven approach to teaching. So I want to look at an alternative paradigm. I have been particularly paying attention, partly because of the work I do, to the work in ethnic studies and some of the community-based work that has been done with kids. And I want to share with you a couple of ethnic studies models that have done a much better job at serving kids than what the kind of mainstream curriculum is that probably most of you see in the schools. Just a couple of definitions of ethnic studies. You are probably all sort of aware of what ethnic studies is, but as people who have worked in the field, some of them for as far back as the 1970s, as well as up to the present, or at least, you know, the current, that where ethnic studies focuses really a lot on the recovery of historically subjugated knowledge of oppressed groups, and is used and it forms the basis really for both personal empowerment as well as community empowerment as well as intellectual empowerment. And it's the intellectual empowerment that I'm going to focus on here, but that's also a part of the personal empowerment and the community empowerment. So let me look briefly at a program in Alaska called Math in the Cultural Context. Anybody heard of it here? Outside of Native communities in Alaska, I don't run into people who have heard of this project. And it's really a very interesting project. It was started about 10 years ago by a group that included an anthropologist, some math educators, and some elders from the Yupik Eskimo community. The Yupik people are one of the indigenous peoples of Alaska. And so through this collaboration, they put together a math curriculum that now has 10 modules to use in the elementary school that combine the NCTM, National Council for the Teachers of Mathematics standards, with Yupik community-based knowledge. So for instance, this curriculum here, Picking Berries, connects mathematical concepts on graphing and measuring with local berry picking. Or this one here that connects doing proofs, perimeter and area with building a fish rack. And in this slide, it's sort of hard to read from a distance, but I put the mathematical content as well as the cultural content that's been put together. The research that's been done on how this curriculum impacts on Native youth, they've done some pre-test, post-test control group design studies where they look at kids in schools using math as a cultural concept, Native kids, and Native kids in schools not using it. the Native kids in schools using it are learning math better than the Native kids in schools not using it. And there's also other research that looks at its impact on teachers. Native teachers using this end up teaching better because it draws on the knowledge that they bring into the classroom rather than telling the teachers that they have to leave that knowledge at the door. So really interesting project that is doing a better job at closing the achievement gap for Native youth in Alaska than what you generally see out in the schools today. The other one that I want to talk a little bit about is the Rasa Studies model in Tucson, Arizona. You've probably, many of you have heard about the conflict over ethnic studies in Tucson, yes? Yeah, okay. This is a schema that Agustin Romero and Julio Camarota put together that kind of takes the key elements of the Mexican-American Studies program as it was designed in Tucson. And it has some elements to it. What they were doing with the project is helping Latino students develop an academic identity that connects with their identity as Latino students. And helping the students see that you can be a strong intellectual as a Latino student without having to leave Latino-ness at the door somewhere. The curriculum was designed a historically and culturally relevant curriculum using Chicano studies frameworks. And designed around issues of social justice. It was also designed using the state standards. You're just using different content, but to teach to the state standards, because you have to do that. The curriculum was also designed as a college prep curriculum, even though most of the students coming into the program were students who were in remedial classes on the verge of dropping out. So as an academically rigorous curriculum. The pedagogy emphasized students as critical thinkers, students as producers of knowledge rather than as consumers of knowledge that somebody else produced, and students as community researchers. So in the high school project, the students all had community-based research projects that they would do using social science research methodologies that they would then analyze using social science frameworks. And then the relationships in the program were relationships built on a genuine respect between the teachers and the students as whole human beings who come from families and come from communities that the teachers also have relationships with. This program has amassed a real interesting track record of success with the students. And I'll just show you a couple of slides, which you probably can't see this one, but I'll explain sort of what's on it. This slide is looking at the proportion of students who go through the Rasa Studies program who graduate from high school. In Tucson, right now, about somewhere around 50% of Latino students are graduating from high school. Students who go through this program are graduating in the 90%. 91%, 93%, 95%. This is about a 5-year, 6-year period look at the graduation rates. Most of the students are then also going on to college. In terms of academic achievement, they've looked at the students' achievement in reading, literacy, and mathematics, and have found that students going through the Rasa Studies program are also achieving at a higher rate in those fields than comparison groups of kids in the same schools. So for over this 6-year period, the blue lines represent the Mexican-American students on retaking the reading test for Arizona as compared to other students in the same schools who weren't in the Rasa Studies program. Now, what's also interesting is when you look at the how the kids were doing in mathematics, it's also the same thing. The Rasa students were outscoring everybody else, and the program doesn't teach mathematics. But what was happening was that it was helping the students acquire a sense of themselves as intellectuals who are fully capable of succeeding in school and who know how to use education to make a difference in their own communities. So the kids were taking just school across the board successfully. This program has been outlawed by white politicians who thought it was too radical. Just a few days ago, a judge, it then has gone through desegregation work, and I won't bore you with all the details there, but a plan has been written up for Tucson to meet its desegregation requirements, which includes culturally responsive pedagogy, a culturally responsive curriculum, evaluating teachers on their ability to use culturally responsive pedagogy. And just a few days ago, a judge ruled yes in favor of this. So this is very exciting. But why do we stick to the test-driven, top-down paradigm when there are these examples of alternative paradigms that are actually working better for kids? And I think to answer that question, we need to look at neoliberalism, which I'm going to do just briefly, and then come back into what teachers might be able to do in the classroom. This graph here, which actually restoration of elite power isn't my term, but it illustrates very well. It's from David Harvey. His book, Brief History of Neoliberalism, is where I got the graph. But this illustrates the proportion of national income that is controlled by the top 0.1% of the United States, France, and Britain from 1913 until almost 2000. And you can see at the time of World War I where there was a kind of a dip in the proportion where the top 0.1% of the population had about 8% of the income of this country. Then we went into the New Deal and the growth of unions. And during the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt was concerned about pulling the nation out of the recession. And so a number of measures were passed, which include things like public works programs, emergency reliefs, public protection like Social Security, that's when it was put into place, regulations on corporations, progressive taxation, the inheritance tax, and also the National Labor Relations Act was passed, providing the basis for unions to be able to form to negotiate with management. And as a result of this work, there was some income redistribution. And so you can see the fortunes of the top 1/10% dropping to the point where by about the 1940s, they still controlled way more than, 0.1% of the income. They controlled about 2% of the income of the country. But still, there was a drop there. And we come up to the 1960s where you have the various civil rights movements, the African-American civil rights movement, then followed by Mexican-American civil rights movement, Native American civil rights movement, women's movement, disability movement, gay and lesbian movement, to broaden who it is that has access to a share of the pie in the country. And you had then the beginnings of neoliberalism, which started, you can sort of historically trace, to 1947, when there was a meeting of some folks led by a guy named Friedrich von Hayek, who adopted some core ideas from what sort of is known as classical liberalism. And these core ideas were around individualism, private property, and market competition. And they kind of had the philosophy of dividing the world between, and we've heard these terms in the last election, the makers and the takers. And during this last election, in fact, where we heard about 47% of the population being the takers, okay, you can go back to the beginnings of neoliberalism, where these folks were saying, look, policies should benefit the makers, not the takers. The takers being kind of like parasites who are taking wealth off of the people who are creating the wealth. So let's start reworking the economy to reward those who are creating the wealth. And you can see where it's people who have been losing fortunes who are arguing that we need to reverse this thing. So, and then, so neoliberalism as an economic strategy was then tried out outside of the US before it was tried out inside of the US. Beginning during the 1970s with Chile, under the dictator Pinochet. And people of the wealthy in Chile will talk about the expansion of the economy during that time. People who were poor will talk about the real loss of access to jobs, gutting education that also took place during that time. In the United States, the beginnings of neoliberalism and the beginnings of changing the way we think about institutions, including schools, began during about the 1970s, when the National Association for Manufacturers kind of did three things during the 1970s. They set up business lobbying in Washington, D.C., and moved their headquarters from New York to Washington, D.C. to have closer access to the people on the Hill. They established PACs, the political action committees, to then start electing people who would be more friendly to shifting the way economics was done. And they started setting up conservative think tanks with the explicit purpose of helping to mold public opinion so that the public would buy into the changes that they were trying to propose. And so beginning in 1978, under Democratic administration, we had the beginnings of tax cuts for the top income brackets and tax cuts for corporations. So just to do a brief look at patterns over the last few years, this chart looks at corporate profits after taxes from the 1950s projected until 2020. You can kind of see, except for the recession, when these corporate profits dipped, you know, there's a definite trend to the line here. And a drop in corporate taxes at the same time. So when we talk about thinking about raising taxes, in many ways it's to make up for taxes that have been cut and to try to reinstitute rather than new taxes. We also have a shrinking middle class. There's been talk in this country about the growing gap between rich and poor. But when you really look at it over time, there really has been a fall off in the middle class, where the majority of people who are no longer middle class have been downwardly mobile, but some people have been upwardly mobile, giving us more of an hourglass-shaped society. And this one is interesting, looking at the average household after-tax income over a 25-year period between 1979 and 2006 in quintiles. The poorest fifth saw an 11% rise in income, although actually if you control for inflation, it wasn't, the poorest fifth lost ground, they didn't gain ground. But then for each quintile going up, income over that 25-year period went up a little bit more. But look what happens with the top 1%, a 256% rise in income. Now, this is all translating into loss of money for public services. And I'm just going to focus on schools and then kind of go into how teachers might think about approaching practice. But paying for college, there's been, as all of you who work in universities know, a decline in money that's going into higher education. This is sort of across the country. People talk now about the privatization of public education. And in California, if I look at the drop in paying for college, it's a much steeper drop. This is a national look, but it's a much steeper drop over the past 25 years. This is interesting, looking at loss of money, public money for public schools. This chart here looks at states between 2008, well, let's say school funding in 2012 as compared to what it was in that state in 2008, okay, 5 years ago. And for most of the states of the country, there's been a fairly dramatic drop in per pupil funding over the last 5 years. Illinois has lost about $103 per student over the last 5 years. California, where I live, has lost over $1,000 per student over the last 5 years. And for those of you who work in schools, you know what this translates into. larger class sizes, fewer teachers, fewer materials. In California, we got rid of the arts a long time ago, partly because it was expensive and partly because, you know, to try to get kids' reading and math scores up. But that we're really seeing a gutting of public resources going into public education. And this last slide here looks at concentration of media. On the internet, there are a lot of different graphics you can get that show media empires. And this one I kind of like, that has the 6 largest media empires and then what all is within their empires. And I put little blue circles here where school materials, textbooks and stuff, are located, because the shrinking numbers of large corporations that control the media really is one of the ways that our consciousness gets shaped. The messages that are allowable from these media empires really do have boundaries around them. And this came through to me most clearly years ago when I was giving a presentation to a group of publishers about whose perspectives were in K-12 curricula. And at the end of it, I was walking down the hall with somebody, and I forget now what publishing company he was from. He was one of the head people of this publishing company. But he said, you know, we're owned by Raytheon, which makes Patriot missiles. So there are some things that just you might want to see, like a critique of militarism in the textbooks, but it's not going to be there. And I was like, oh, wow. So, what can teachers do? Because I think it's critically important for teachers and kids and parents and communities to speak back against what's happening to our public schools and our other public spaces. I have taught for many years a course in multicultural curriculum design, and I'll illustrate the practice of 3 teachers as they tried to think their way through what to do in the classroom. This graph here, this chart, this whatever it is, illustrates the schema that I use when I'm teaching multicultural curriculum design, of where I start with a big idea, and those of you who are using Understanding by Design would be familiar with this, in which I try to have teachers think about developing something that's standards conscious. And I don't use the word standards driven because I don't want them to think that your curriculum has to be driven by the standards, but you at least need to pay attention to what's in them. And then we work through the various elements on this chart here. We spend quite a bit of time with teachers' beliefs, the ideology that teachers bring, because regardless of what materials you're using, what you're handed, your own beliefs have an awful lot to do with what ends up happening in the classroom. Even in your relationships with kids, the teacher's beliefs are really important. Transformative intellectual knowledge refers to the historically subjugated knowledge in ethnic studies, women's studies, critical cultural studies, critical disability studies, that questions, that envisions another world, really, and provides the intellectual basis for thinking about that and working toward that world. Student community knowledge is the funds of knowledge that kids bring from home that is present within their communities and that kids learn as they're growing up. Intellectual challenge refers to the level at which the teacher is pitching the curriculum, and I encourage teachers to think, regardless of who you're teaching and what their skill levels are, what would you be doing if you were preparing them all to be university ready? And then how would you scaffold that? Assessment of learning, what are some meaningful ways that you can assess student learning in ways that are culturally relevant in your classroom as a way of informing and improving teaching? And then what resources and classroom strategies can you use that support student engagement around the knowledge that you've chosen? So let me illustrate what 3 teachers have done with this as ways of trying to be multicultural social justice educators. this is Kathy, who just retired about a year and a half ago. Kathy was a first grade teacher in Salinas, California. And by the way, the demographics you'll see of kids reflect the demographics of where I live. Monterey County, where I live, has the highest proportion of Latinos of any county in California. Not the highest number, but the highest proportion. So like Kathy's class is all Latino. Her students are mostly children of farm workers who work out in the fields. Most of them are immigrants from Mexico. Some of them are second generations. But Kathy wanted to teach a unit where students look critically at agriculture in Monterey County. And she explains that this is partly because the students are from an agricultural background, but it's also because she grew up on a farm in Ohio and had seen how farmers were losing their farms to big agribusiness. And she wanted students to start thinking about why is it that increasingly ordinary families can't afford to own farms, and what's happened to the agriculture industry both in Mexico as well as in the United States. Here she's talking about agriculture affects the lives of my students. The parents don't want the kids to grow up to be farm workers, but the parents are interested, and Kathy's interested in the students knowing more about where their parents work and the context in which their parents work. And Kathy also, she does quite a bit in her teaching, or did when she was teaching, and you'll see it in this unit, of where students can bring political questions into the classroom. And sometimes people will ask, aren't first graders too young to bring politics up with? And what she explained in this quote is, and this is particularly when she has class meetings, of students will bring in all kinds of stuff. Sometimes it's, somebody hit me on the playground. Sometimes it's, why are we having a war in Iraq? Sometimes it's my parents were talking about this tax initiative, like she's talking about here, to keep the county hospital open. And so the classroom should be a place where students can explore questions rather than having questions closed down because we assume that students are too young for them. So for this interdisciplinary unit, for social studies, she bases the unit around the United Farm Workers. This is the flag of the United Farm Workers, and she includes in the social studies part having the students compare and contrast small farming with agribusiness. And then labor organizing and Dust Bowl refugees. She works with parents to teach and design and teach parts of this unit, partly because some of the parents have lived in Mexico and have worked on small farms and can help contrast small farms with the agribusiness that they work in now, almost more graphically than she can. The parents, some of them are also active in the United Farm Workers, and so co-teaching with them sort of makes sense. The Dust Bowl refugees was interesting to me because I learned through Kathy that Salinas, California, a large proportion of the white population there are descendants of Dust Bowl refugees. And what she would like the white people to do is understand some of your own history, because it's not that different from the history of who are the brown people now. And then maybe we can find ways of working together. For language arts, farming and local history, vocabulary. For music, labor organizing songs. And by the way, she has all of this mapped against the standards for first grade. So if anybody comes in and asks, why are the students singing, De Colores or something like that, she can point to the standard that she's addressing. For science, they do plant growth. For math, graphing and more than, less than. And I was interested in particularly in what she did with math, because people will sometimes say, math and social justice, what's the relationship? Just one example here of how she was teaching graphing and more than, less than. I walked into her classroom. I went when she was teaching parts of this unit and saw something that looks like this across the front of the room, where there was a bulletin board, and then in Spanish, because she was teaching this in Spanish, the names of different crops. So apio is celery, flores, flowers, lechuga, lettuce, alcachofa, artichokes, las fresas, strawberries, broccoli, and casa, working at home, otros trabajos, working in other fields. And then she had the students on a 5x7 card write their name and where their parents work. And then she had the students come up and bring the cards up and put them, creating a bar graph. And she explained to me that we can use bar graphs about anything, but she wanted the students to create a bar graph based on their lived experience, essentially. And then she had the students then work with numeric reasoning, where they would do more than, less than reasoning. Are there more people working in strawberries than working at home? How many more people are working in broccoli than working in, you know, blah, blah, blah. As a way of having the students then reason about their lives. And here's a picture of the actual graph with an actual kid. But this was one way that she tries to address multiculturalism, social justice, students' funds of knowledge within the context of working with standards and helping the students to develop their political consciousness while they're learning reading, writing, and math, really. And I'm going to come back to her towards the end because she's very interesting. The second teacher here, Terry was a middle school teacher at the time when I did this study. She's now a high school teacher. And she was teaching a 2-hour language arts and social studies block. When I had her as a master's student, she talked to me about how she really wanted to bring democracy into the classroom and run the classroom as a democracy and run the school as a democracy, because she believed very passionately in the power of democracy. And this is a quote from her master's thesis where she's quoting Paulo Freire. And I'm going to talk about how she transformed a unit on ancient Egypt, because in the school where she was working, she was starting to run into some conflict with her principal. She had taken a group of students to the school board to protest a school closing. It was actually the student's idea, not her idea, but the principal is, you're rabble-rousing, you're taking your kids to the school board, so I want you to just stick to what's in the textbook, stick to the standards. So she had a unit that she had taught for several years on ancient Egypt. And she has, by the way, a write-up of how she transformed this unit in a book, Turning on Learning, that Carl Grant and I did. And the way she organized the unit was essentially in 3 parts. Students would learn something about the geography of ancient Egypt. They would learn something about cultural artifacts and belief systems of ancient Egypt. And they would learn something about the social structure of ancient Egypt. And she told me that what the students really loved learning about was mummies. That was what got them. The same semester, when she had taken students to the school board, she had also become very concerned about how students were treating each other in her school. She taught in a school that was a desegregated school located in a predominantly white upper middle class neighborhood in Monterey. And the students who were bused into the school were mainly low-income students, mainly Latino, but there were also some African American students and some Asian students as well. And when she would walk around the school, she would note students kind of negative expressions toward each other. And she was also concerned about why it was that when you would have student elections, the same group of popular kids from affluent families always got elected. And she thought, why don't the students stop and think about how they're treating each other and who they're electing as their representatives? Why do they just sort of go along with these norms? And then she became aware, well, I think she was already aware, but she told me about how this kind of hierarchy of importance, which was really what that was in the school, was reflected also in the teacher's lounge. In this particular school, in the teacher's lounge, there was a table where this one group of teachers would sit every day when they came in for lunch. Nobody else could sit there. It had a tablecloth, a candelabra, and everybody else, it was like, you know, like this is the queen group and everybody else has to go sit someplace else. And so these hierarchies, she really wanted the students to question. So she was teaching a class called Teen Problems and brought these issues up to her class. And the students said, Well, let's do a survey to find out to what extent there's actually a problem in the school. So she worked with the students to create a survey. They went around to different classrooms, gave out the survey, got the back, analyzed the data, and I'll just share with you a couple of questions that were analyzed around the problem of the oppressive hierarchy within the school. At my school, students treat each other differently because they're in different social groups. About half the students agreed with that. And yeah, okay, there's a problem here. At my school, students treat each other differently because of race. About a quarter of the students agreed with that. They were mainly the students of color. Mainly the white students didn't see the differential treatment that was going on. So this provided a way for her to be able to look at the issues in class. So the students then analyzed these data, tried to come up with some ways in which they could make the school a school that worked better for all of the people in it. But the following year, when Terry went back to reteach this unit on geography, on ancient Egypt, she wanted to rethink the structure of the unit. Oh, and by the way, she also had the students draw a diagram of how they saw American society. And most of them drew something like a pyramid. And a couple of them drew like with the president at the top and what they called bums at the bottom, which she said was what her parents largely called homeless people. So she designed the unit so that the central idea now, instead of being ancient Egypt, was hierarchical versus egalitarian societies. But she would use Egypt as one of the vehicles to teach that. Studying ancient Egypt and the social structure, they studied the pyramid of power as it was reflected in the ancient Egyptian society and did some readings and role play to try to put the students in the position of either being the one making the rules or the one having to follow the rules, and how that felt and how people reacted in those conditions, to try to help students really start think critically about hierarchical societies. In her literature class, which again, this was social studies and literature in a 2-hour block. She then had readings where students would critically analyze the pyramid of power as it reflects in United States society. And so she had different books such as Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and different articles and things that students would read that were literary works that would have them start critically looking at the nature of U.S. society so they could sort of bounce off ancient Egyptian society against U.S. society. And then she also, throughout all of this, tried to engage them in bringing the ideas back into the school and how we treat each other in the school and how a hierarchical society tends to be reflected, and what can we do to try to make our treatment of each other reflect more egalitarian principles. So that's kind of what Terry did. The last teacher I'll share with you is Angela, who was a 4th and 5th grade teacher in a school in a low-income community. It had no racial ethnic majority. It was a very diverse group of students. She was a 2nd-year teacher, and she was struggling with a couple of things. One was how to actively engage the students when the classroom behavior gets chaotic. She was struggling with classroom management. A lot of beginning teachers are. And you'll also see how she ended up struggling with how to teach perspectives of indigenous people as an alternative to the dominant perspective when the curriculum is from the dominant perspective and not from an indigenous perspective. When I asked the teachers in my graduate class to figure out a main idea of something you were going to be teaching, Angela said, well, in about December, I'm going to be teaching the 13 colonies. So she came up to me after class and said, how did indigenous people experience colonization? And I'm thinking, gee whiz, you've been through all the way through college and haven't ever been asked to think about that. And I had this dialogue going inside myself, but I was like, oh, that's a good question. Okay, let's look at that. So I wanted her to start doing some reading of transformative intellectual knowledge as well as analyzing her own textbook. I've analyzed textbooks in California for the treatment of indigenous people, and the basic idea is indigenous people are featured and then gradually disappear, sort of replicating the colonization and genocide against indigenous people. I have all of the teachers go through and do a basic count of who is in whatever textbooks they're teaching from. As a way of taking the temperature. There's a lot that doesn't get at the underlying ideology and stuff, but it does help you take the temperature of whose perspectives are in the textbooks. And this is usually a real eye-opener, because what the teachers always end up discovering, especially when they pool data from across textbooks, is that textbooks still teach a white curriculum into which African Americans have been added, and only a few non-African American people of color have been sprinkled here and there. So when she analyzed her textbook, it was the first time she'd been asked to do that, and it was like, oh my God. And she saw the pattern of indigenous people basically being erased from the United States and the way that the United States history is told. So I then had her do some reading from indigenous people's perspectives about U.S. history. And these were just some of the things that she read. But what she came away from reading these was there was a whole different story being told from an indigenous point of view. And this is my words, not her words. But essentially, the story, if I sort of encapsulate it, that indigenous people tell about this country is a story of well-developed, sophisticated cultures that have been here, massive dispossession and genocide. And that usually gets really glossed over in the textbooks. The fact that Europeans actually learned a lot from indigenous people while they were in the process of exterminating them. And then what's really important is the main issues today of reclaiming political sovereignty, rebuilding economies, nation building, identity building, current political status as semi-sovereign nations, in many cases language reclamation, and there are some really big ongoing issues today. Okay, as Angela was working through this stuff, she came into my office one day and she was going, what am I going to do? I have to put together a unit. And I have the stories are going like this. They're opposite. You can't just put them together. And I said, well, yeah, you have two different perspectives. I want you to narrow down to a specific time and place and figure out how you can teach two different perspectives. You can't do all of U.S. history in this short time you have for a unit, but you can do a time and place. So she came up with what I think turned out to be a brilliant idea. Massachusetts during the 1600s, you had the British colonists, and you had three groups of indigenous people. You had the Haudenosaunee, which is the League of the Iroquois, you had the Wampanoag, and you had the Pequot. And so she developed a trial, which she called the Case of the Missing Deer, that she also then linked to the ecology unit in her science class. So on day one, this were 45-minute on day one, 45 minutes, day two, real short unit, trying to pack a lot in. So day one, she gave them background information about the Wampanoag, how a trial works, and the Haudenosaunee Great Law, which sets out the Iroquois legal system for a trial. And it's actually very interesting because the structure of the trial is very similar to the British structure, but the purpose is different. Rather than trying to find out who's guilty and then set punishment, it's trying to find out a way of building reconciliation and balance. On day two, she did a simulation on the ecology of the deer population, which I went and watched, and it became very chaotic. And then on day three, a role play, and this is what I wanted to focus in on. Because during days one and day two, she was still struggling with the classroom management issue. On day three, she did a lot of work putting together a really well thought out role play of two different perspectives. Some of the kids played the role of Wampanoag witnesses. Some of the kids played the role of British witnesses. And she had done research to come up with names. Each kid had a roll card with a name and with some information about them. And she spent a lot of time trying to get authentic names and some information that would be authentic about the various witnesses. There were 5 judges, and there was also the jury. And so then when the judges were out, and then when the jury was out, the kids had some thinking questions to do about who was guilty and what would you do to try to bring things into balance again. What kind of reconciliation strategies would you use? And so the kids were like, you know, writing. And this is all of the classroom management issues that she had had disappeared because the unit was so engaging to the kids. In fact, there was a parent in there who happened to bring, I went and watched this, the parent who happened to bring, no, he didn't bring a camera and wished he would have, because he was saying, oh, this is so good. I should have brought my video camera. But what came out of this, there's actually a lot in this story that I don't have time to unpack. But she did learn that misbehavior results in boredom. Her own prior education had been severely limited, and she had to go do a lot of work to unlearn what she had learned and then relearn in order to bring indigenous knowledge into the classroom and have indigenous knowledge be the way that the whole problem was looked at. And I found that very, very interesting that she was able to do that in this short, very engaging lesson. There's a lot more here that she got out of it. But as it relates to reworking the curriculum for multicultural and social justice, I found this to be an interesting example. But and the question of what to do and what does this mean for teachers, one of the things that to me it means for teachers was when I'm thinking about these three teachers, Kathy in some ways was different from the other two, Terry and Angela, because Kathy was quite engaged in immigrant rights organized activity in her own community. So when Kathy was teaching about the United Farm Workers and immigrant rights issues, they were the same issues that students' parents were grappling with and some of the parents organizing around in order to have a political voice to make a better life for their kids, both through school as well as through changing policies that work against immigrants and that work against low-wage workers. And Kathy was engaged with these communities. Kathy told me that she would sometimes go to immigrant rights protests and see some of her students there with their parents. So there was a real connection between what she was doing in her classroom and what was happening outside of the classroom. And as a result, she was able to keep teaching this stuff year after year, getting better and better at it, in ways that really synced with where the parents were coming from in the community that she was working. Whereas the other two designed and taught really interesting units, but they tended to be one-shot units because they actually didn't grow out of the teachers' engagement with a broader community. And what I've tried to encourage teachers to do is to connect with either activist communities that you're working, activist groups in your community, or teacher activist groups that are around so that you're not by yourself. Because if you're trying to make these changes by yourself, you're probably going to get frustrated, you're going to get burned out. If a principal comes in and says you can't do that, you may find yourself in a position you're going, well, I guess I can't, without having some allies to help figure out what to do and where to go with that. So the organization that this button represents is one that I helped start in California. This is its website, the California chapter of NAME, and the national organization, National Association for Multicultural Education, which has local chapters. And I understand that there's one or two in Illinois, but I don't really have information about them. But those become places where teachers can join in with other teachers. You also have, in Illinois, Teachers for Social Justice, which is more up in Chicago, but it is certainly organized around these kinds of issues. And the curriculum fair that they put on every year certainly highlights the kind of teaching that these teachers were doing. So it becomes another way of affiliating with something that's bigger and broader than yourself. And the Chicago Teachers Union that I can't come to Illinois and not mention, because to me it's been such a wonderful coming together of teachers in a way that specifically critiques the neoliberal gutting of resources from public education and the way the teachers have been getting dumped on in that process, and tying that to the welfare of the kids that they're actually working with in the schools. So when the teachers organized to push back against strategies that were harming kids and harming teachers, and had some success doing so. To me, this is a model of what we as educators should be doing. And so it's a local organization to learn from and work from. So in closing, just a quote from Paulo Freire where he says that there is no such thing as a neutral education process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of the world. And I think all of us ultimately have a choice as to where we'll position ourselves in the political system of the schools. But we can't choose not to position ourselves because we're a part of the process. So thank you.